No. You were not negotiating. No, I've been through my turn.
I just used to read the reports back.
Kevin, actually reached out to the other day.
Very good, thank you.
Yeah, are you thinking right?
Well, I was going to negotiate that. I know it said you weren't buying the media, so let's talk afterwards. If I did, it would be more like I'm going to go Fed
Yeah. The only concern we have is that we're in the room.
Yeah.
Not feel like our crap.
Right. Well, tell them I'm here, and then we can, in case they're concerned. But I don't want to inhibit discussion. That's what I understand.
Yeah. So I mean, if it's really like let's not use it.
Tell them I can use their names. I can just I can do it without using names. That might be.
Sounds good. Yeah.
Oh, yes.
I don't want to use this. Yeah. I don't know his Gmail, but it's not. Around the which way? The answer is yeah, I mean, they're obviously yeah, something like that. Like really hard. Obviously, you're not going to bring the stakeholder along. Any of this stuff is a whole year. Just kind of how we're a method. Should we just get started? I don't need any. All right. So yeah. I'm just conscious of but if we can't decide. Yes.
So searching around for all the utility today. It's really that. So it's not just yeah. People like to talk. Vision, following the right of the whole thing. And who my statistician is, what time
Put it back in the box.
So. Yeah, we're gonna have a business card, got gold seal on it. Seriously. We have room until 1:30.
Good afternoon. Sorry for the delayed startup, but on arriving here, we found that the cord that powers up was a 15-pin plug that like it was from about 20 years ago. So maybe that's just an indicator that we need to help make Congress a little sharper on technology and science policy.
Well, we did do a study on standards in 1990.
So did they? Okay, a study on standards. Well, okay. I don't know if standards were implemented here. The legislative branch capacity working groups monthly meeting. Great to see a lot of new faces here. Great to see some folks that have been here many times before. I want to give special thanks to Senator Moran's office, particularly Senator Moran's office, who has been so helpful in getting us a room in the CDC both this time and a couple times previous. That's very helpful, very much appreciated. And if any of you who work in congressional offices can help us out in future months, please let me know, because it's an enduring challenge to be able to get ourselves a room here in the Capitol. So today, the topic is Office Technology Assessment, the late great OTA, which was probably 20 years ago, 21 years now, I think. I'm going to step aside and hand over the microphone to our two speakers. First of whom is Adam Kuiper, the editor of New Atlantis, Marvelous Journal, and the author of the definitive piece on the Office of Technology Assessment. We pushed out on legbranch.com a link and a teaser to the piece the other day. So if you haven't read it, put it in your long reads collection and give it a read, because it's really is an amazing piece. So Adam's going to lead off. And then we're going to hear from John Costello. John Costello is an interesting guy. He is kind of the example of the new generation of folks who are hitting the hill. They are a cross between policy wonk and tech expert. And as governing becomes more and more done through devices, these are the sort of people we need here. And he's going to talk a bit about OTA and the work that he's been doing on looking forward, what we might do either bring OTA back or somehow, some way, making Congress great again in science and technology.
Build a wall.
So with that, I will turn it over to Adam. They'll each have their say for 10 minutes, 15 minutes each pop. And then after that, we will turn it over to the audience for a wide open discussion. I should say that we do have a reporter here. You see right here, works for government exec. He has agreed that if he writes something about this, that he's certainly not going to be attributing any quotes to any individuals. So no worries, you won't be outed for anything clever or insightful you might say. With that, I'll turn it over.
So, as Kevin said, I'm Adam Kuiper. I'm editor of The New Atlantis, which is a quarterly journal about the ethical and political questions raised by modern science and technology. It was 11 years ago that I wrote the essay that Kevin sent around about OTA, which I apologize for its enormous length. It's a big subject and needed a lot of space. So those of you who've already read it, I'm grateful to you. Those of you who have yet to put it on your nightstand and put it aside for some time when you're having trouble getting sleep at night. Just before I start, can I see by show of hands who in this room, if anyone, worked at OTA? Wonderful. Okay. Very good. Great. Yeah. Well, welcome. I hope that in the conversation that follows, if you'd like to characterize differently anything in my description of the agency, I look forward to hearing what you've got to say about it. I won't try to to rehearse everything, recapitulate everything that's in the very long essay. I'll just give you a few quick points. And I guess the place to start is with the name of the agency. Why is it the Office of Technology Assessment? The term technology assessment has a kind of unusual history. It really developed in the 1960s. Although some academics who have studied this trace some of its intellectual origins back 2, 3, or 4 decades earlier. And the idea was this, especially starting in the 1960s, there came to be this widespread cultural realization in the United States that various aspects of technology were having profound social and political implications, and very little forethought was going into how those technological advances were being adopted. This coincided with the rise of the environmental movement. When we talk about the environmental movement today, we tend to think of it in terms of the bills and legislation that characterize the environmental movement. But at the time, when people talk about the environmental movement, it was much more early on, especially a movement in people's attitudes and thoughts and minds, a movement that characterized for the first time a realization that maybe the market forces that were driving technology were leading to outcomes that might, in some ways, be socially undesirable or might have all sorts of negative consequences for future generations. And that style of thinking spread from environmental questions to a whole range of other questions touching on science and technology. There are other cultural forces that came together at that moment in the late 60s and early 1970s. But within the halls of Congress, there came to be some sense that this branch, the first branch of our federal government, needed some source for expertise on scientific and technological questions. What did the practice of technology assessment look like? What did it mean to assess a technology? The term has meant a lot of different things over time. Some of the people who wrote about and practiced technology assessment early on basically meant it as a kind of predictive practice. We would try to predict what the future would hold for science and technology. Other people saw it as a much more complicated exercise, and eventually in the OTA offices, technology assessment came to be essentially whatever OTA was doing, which meant a process that when it was finally founded in 1972 and then stood up in the 70s and then really hit stride in the 80s, looked something like this. There would be some question that OTA was assigned to take up. And it might be assigned by the board that governed it. OTA was governed by a 12-member board, 6 members from the House, 6 members from the Senate, and 3 of the representatives were Democrats, 3 were Republicans, the senators were Democrats, 3 were Republicans. So a strictly bipartisan oversight board. So some of the tasks that OTA was given came from that board. Some came from committee chairmen. Some arose out of conversations with members and then formally came from committees. And so OTA would take up some tasks in studying the subject, and their studies were unlike the work of CRS, or unlike most of the work that GAO does. This was work that actually brought in stakeholders. They didn't just look at what science has been published. They didn't just look at the technical literature. They didn't just look at the writing that they could find in various databases. They brought in experts from science. They brought in experts from industry. They brought in policymakers. And they sat down in meetings in the OTA offices or offsite, discussed thoroughly every aspect of the subjects that they were assigned to address. Most of OTA's work product appeared in a series of reports or technology assessments. Overall, over the course of the agency's tenure, some 700 reports were published on a widely varying range of subjects. They wrote about many subjects that are still relevant today, and many of the reports are still relevant today. Nuclear power, oil shale, a whole range of medical technologies. As I wrote at one point in the essay, in a single month, OTA published reports on Russian nuclear proliferation, hip fractures in people over 50, drug abuse, the use of virtual reality for combat training, and a few other subjects, all in 1 month. On average, OTA published about 20 reports every year. The agency, very early on, came to be seen by conservative critics as being a creature of the left. This was understandable, partly because its first director was a liberal Democrat, Emilio Daddario, World War II hero, Korean War vet, member of Congress from Connecticut. He's the guy who basically wrote the bill that created OTA, and then after he left Congress, he was asked to come back to be OTA's first director. Another reason it was seen early on as captured by the left was the intense involvement of Senator Ted Kennedy. But by the late 70s, OTA kind of hit a moment of crisis. A new director was brought in, or actually this was mid-70s, new director was brought in, a Republican, Russ Peterson, a Republican from Delaware, who was a very liberal Republican, had worked on environmental issues in the Nixon administration. After his departure, OTA still dealing with all sorts of complicated staffing issues related to whether the personnel were too liberal and how they were assigned. A new director was brought in, Jack Gibbons. Jack was, he did a lot of work to maintain the independence of OTA, to really give it credibility and independence, and to push back against the efforts over the long years that he ran the agency to make it, to have it captured by various political forces here on the Hill. Yeah, so Jack ran the agency for the longest tenure, I would say almost 15 years or so. And he was a physicist, as I would call by training. And when I interviewed him, he defended the agency. I spoke with all 4 of the agency's directors, reaching Congressman Daddario in his nursing home, actually. Jack fought back against the claims that just because he, in his personal life and in his subsequent career as the science advisor in the Clinton administration, just because he worked with Democrats and was a Democrat, that his running of the agency was especially left-wing. I think that's correct. I think the agency, generally speaking, did not show a left-wing bias in its work. If it showed any bias at all, it would come out in some specific reports or in some behind-the-scenes aspects of its work, or it would, I guess you would say that its bias wasn't necessarily political, but what you might call technocratic, which is to say OTA would tend to prefer scientific and technological solutions for questions or policy solutions for questions when non-technical or non-policy solutions might have addressed the questions that OTA was taking up. Just a few words about what happened after OTA was shuttered when the what issues might OTA have taken up that could have helpfully, successfully informed policy debates? So OTA was shuttered in '95, right? So '95 is the year that Netscape has its IPO and the internet, which OTA had written a little about earlier, but the internet really hits it big. Is the year that the world first learns of the first cloned mammal. Obviously, the terrorist attacks of 2001 have a whole range of implications for policy questions related to science and technology issues, from the Patriot Act and its various provisions to how we ought to fight against terrorists and secure the country. Each of those overlaps with science and technology in various ways. I imagine that if we were to go through year after year after year, we'd see a whole range of questions where OTA could have informed Congress and informed the public debate. The question is, would OTA's work, had it existed, have really made a difference? I think it would have. I think the difference would have been slight, but I think it would have. And I think that, I'd be happy to talk about that some more during the discussion afterwards, but I think there's a case that OTA would have slightly improved congressional understanding and public understanding of a whole range of these questions had it not been shuttered. That's not maybe the strongest case for bringing back OTA. There's a lot more in my essay, and happy to talk more for the discussion. Thank you.
You covered, it was great, it was fantastic. You covered, I think about half of what I was going to cover, so you guys are spared a few minutes. So my name is John Costello. I formerly was a fellow, Congressional Innovation Fellow for Tech Congress. I was an OGR, Government Reform. Before that, I was did private sector work looking at threat intelligence. Before that, I was in the military, worked for the NSA as a another. It's valid from the point that certainly that assessment did not come out in time to be handed out as a deliverable to members of Congress. That's certainly true. But what I think what a lot of sort of critics are forgetting is that OTA often worked with committees and worked with staff and worked with members of Congress. So as that assessment was being made, filtering over to Congress writ large. So I mean that sort of criticism is sort of important to keep in mind. Finally, it was too costly. I mean, again, I find the whole too costly argument to be, I find it to be an odd argument. I mean, it's all about priority, right? It's how much do you want to spend on knowledge? I mean, it really comes to like sort of the final criticism is, can OTA provide value that the private sector isn't already providing, or that academia isn't already providing? And that's ultimately what I think a lot of critics mean by saying it's too costly, is that it's not providing value add that isn't already there. And I think that's that's valid from the standpoint that it could be seems true, but I think there is an independent value in having a in-house capacity. I give you, for instance, one of the things that I worked on while I was in OGR was the OPM investigation. Congress launched an investigation of the OPM Act last year. I, due to my background, was able to provide certain, expertise that helped out the investigation. That is not expertise that would have been sought otherwise, and that's simply due to a trust factor. When the committee is doing their work, they want to know that within the bounds of what they're doing, that everything they say, everything they're looking at stays in the room. And that's extremely valuable for Congress. So while the private sector may provide expertise in the form of notes and papers and meetings, it will never be able, in my opinion, to provide the sort of that confidence, expertise as a service that OTA wants to provide. And that, in my opinion, is the most often overlooked value that OTA provided outside of their technology assessments. So those are the three. Those are sort of the 5 major criticisms of OTA. And I ask you to keep those in mind as we sort of go through this. The various efforts that have come since OTA was shuttered sort of fall into 3 sort of categories. One is reestablishing a separate office. This is the least I think this is the least popular option because it seems like a pretty heavy lift. The authorization's already on the books for OTA. Now GAO's got a separate sort of technology assessment. So essentially, what you'd be asking to do is, you have to fund OTA by putting forward an appropriation. So in reestablishing a separate office, you have to get an additional authorization on the books, and you have to push through an appropriation, which you already have to do if you just wanted to refund OTA. So the question is, why would you do that when you can just sort of restore funding to Office of Technology Assessment? And there's moving the functions of the office to another agency, such as GAO. Now, this has been, I think, the most feasible option, but I think it's been in the realm of replacing OTA. I think it hasn't worked, and I don't think it will continue to work. After speaking with appropriators and speaking with GAO, technology assessment is not GAO's. It's not GAO's job, and anybody who's ever run a household budget, which hopefully is everyone in this room, knows that your main job is to provide food, and provide clothing and shelter for yourself and your family. And that's great, and you like to go on vacation, you like to do other things that are outside of that. But when times get tough, those sort of things fall by the wayside. And if you look at the appropriations history of GAO, you'll see that when their budget is constricted, when their budget goes down, technology assessment suffers. The amount of money that they can put towards technology assessment suffers. And it comes in waves, it really does. In 2008, there was a specific line item in the Senate report. I think it was 2012. There was a line item in the House report that said you would put 1.5 million towards technology assessments. I can tell you this was started in 2008, technology assessment in GAO, like formally with sort of a line item. They said, you'll produce technology assessments from Congress. They produced, I think, if I'm not mistaken, they produced 0. between 2008 and 2011.
Yeah, there's a gap.
Yeah, there was a gap, and that's when the technology assessment started. Granted, that's changed. Speaking with appropriators, they said, well, we need to plus out the GAO, we need to plus out GAO. And my response to that is that hasn't worked, and I'm not confident that it will work. So moving forward, and then the refunding office, there's been a bill, I think, every year since 2008 was refunded OTA at 1.5 million or excuse me, 2.5 million. And most recently was defeated this year. And it had, I think, most bipartisan support it's ever had. And by that, I mean it had, I think, 15 Republicans vote in favor of it. So, sort of to touch on this real quick, is the office needed? And what I mean is there still a pressing need for technology assessment in Congress that is not currently being fulfilled by either the private sector or by congressional support offices? I think we all can agree that certainly is the case. And I give you sort of 3 case studies as to why it is. And it does do, and it sort of piggybacks off what you said, is looking back. I'd like to bring up the encryption debate as a major example of an issue before Congress that OTA could have played a profound role, a very, very profound role, even from when the issue first began, all the way to when legislation was produced, the Byrd-Feinstein bill. OTA would have been able to generate reports, assessments, hearings that came about that were involved in the encryption debate. OTA could have helped with committee work, with investigations the committee launched, with hearings the committee launched, and reviewing testimony, and giving questions to committees. And the Byrd-Feinstein bill, OTA could have called upon to help and understand the equities that were at stake with that bill. And if asked by a committee chairman or a committee or any sort of committee ranking member, could have been able to provide feedback on the bill itself. Absent that, the encryption debate sort of happened as it happened. The second case study I would say was the Office of Personnel Management. I touched on that earlier. You have a lot of investigations right now. You have Congress has an oversight role not against, depends on how you view the relationship between the federal government and Congress, over the federal government, which has an extreme advantage in manning and resources and expertise. And I've been in transcribed interviews where when you're talking to someone from the federal government who has an expertise in technology or science, they can confound congressional inquiry by steeping their responses in technical details. Because it's basically, they're going where Congress, and a lot of times, just absolutely cannot follow. And that, in my opinion, is a major disruption to Congress's ability to conduct effective oversight. I think, in my opinion, that's the strongest argument for OTA. And then finally, and this is sort of like my major interest, artificial intelligence and machine learning. This is something that I could ask each person in this room what that means, and you would all give a different answer. And that's not, it's an incredibly complex thing, but to deal with machine learning and artificial intelligence in the next few years. And I've said that to people before, and they're looking at me like, are you crazy? And I said, look at your phones, driverless cars are coming by themselves. It's a joke. But what that requires is good design, stakeholder participation, and a prescient legislative and regulatory approach. But how is Congress going to get that? What would Congress do? Well, chairman of the NC, where can he turn to say, I want to report on the state of the art of machine learning and artificial intelligence across a variety of sectors and a variety of different verticals? He has no way to do that right now. He would have to reach out to the private sector. He would have to try to talk to GAO, and GAO would say, we can put this behind the 5 other assessments that we're doing over the next 3 years. And that's definitely problematic, especially when my expertise is China. Especially when China, all of your same committee can look at, a working group across 4 or 5 different verticals and say, I want a regulatory and standards framework for artificial intelligence over the next year, and it will happen. And then that will be harmonized all across China, and then the 700 million internet users will have to comply. Those are the, so for me, and this is sort of different, so I have to go, but the final sort of argument for OTA, I think, is a national security and competitiveness one. Unless Congress finds a way to move forward and to really empower itself to make prescient legislation to tackle these issues head on, other nations who have competitive strength and resources to do so will set the standards for us. And that's a very scary idea, especially given the ethical and human rights consideration coming from certain countries. So,
before you wrap up, can I just ask you to kind of update the group on nascent efforts to bring the OTA back?
yes.
And where things are, what are the issues that need to be worked out? What are the politics of moving forward?
The politics are moving forward. Basically, I've been working with Chairman Chase and a few other offices. It's my personal, I think it's my belief that a strategy for OTA needs to come from the right. The left has been trying for years, and in my opinion, and this is not to diminish the left's efforts on this at all, but to me, it's a lot like when my son asked for a cookie before dinner, and I just say no. And we could have already eaten dinner. I just say no at this point. I think it's become just branded as a left issue, and it's been seen as such. And so I think any sort of attempt to bring back OTA needs to have a cavalry charge from the right. It's actually interesting. I was sitting down with appropriators, and we were talking about why won't you fund? Like, basically, we're like, why won't you fund it? And they're like, couldn't you just change the name? Can you just do that? And I was like, all right, fair enough. So basically,
But that's simple.
No. Honestly, it's a huge branding issue. So basically, we put together a proposal, and this proposal is definitely, I want to do this real quick. I don't want to keep you guys more than really necessary. But I put together a proposal to do this in a way that I think is cost effective, address many of the criticisms levied at OTA, does it in a way that I think is very bipartisan, and from my own perspective, addresses some of the national security and competitiveness issues that are at stake. So number one.
Yeah, I don't want to rush. Let's not rush. We don't necessarily need to rush through. I mean, this is the media. I mean, we can have a workshop a little bit on both strategy and dealing with some of the trade-offs that might need to go into making this move forward. That's important.
Okay, cool.
I think people mostly are convinced. How many people? Just a quick show of hands. How many people in the audience think that bringing back OTA is a good idea? Right. So you've won over most of the crowd. Now, how do we do it?
So I think addressing the criticisms is first and foremost. I think it is important. Also, the number one criticism I think that has both a practical and political political obstacle is the idea that OTA represents the narrow interests of Congress. I think that can be primarily defeated by expanding the governing board and making it a process by which we're looking at the Joint Committee on Taxation sort of as a model. So basically, in my proposal, the board would be expanded to 24 members, and it would be made up of the chairman and ranking member or designated representative of 5 committees that the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House designate as 5 or 6 primary committees with jurisdiction over science, technology, and innovation. I do that for a number of reasons. One, as technology becomes in every facet of everything Congress does, it's crossing jurisdictions. So I think it's absolutely important for chairman and ranking members not to think that OTA would sort of subvert their jurisdiction at all. Second of all, broad-basing support politically, I think, is a very viable idea. So getting chairman on board early, I think, will get chairman on board early in the process. I've heard counter arguments that would make the governing board of OTA unwieldy. Maybe not. Previously, the OTA board operated on unanimous consent. After speaking with a number of people involved in that process, the process of how OTA governed is particularly interesting. But I think that's probably one of the best ways forward. And essentially would turn OTA into, the governing board of OTA into essentially a joint committee, but without legislative authority. And I think that would be, and honestly, if I had my druthers, OTA would be a joint committee of science, technology, and innovation with a attached sort of semi-independent government, congressional support agency. But that's a huge heavy lift. What we're looking at is sort of changing the scope of OTA and where it was most needed in Congress now. And I think the intersection between science, technology, and innovation, by innovation I mean developing new technologies, researching new technologies, bringing new technologies to market. I think that has become, you can't separate that out from technology anymore. I think we need to recognize that business has a profound role to play as both a stakeholder and driver of technology. So basically the OTA would be expanded to look at how, the innovation environment. We're also looking at how to expand OTA to make it more relevant to the workings of Congress. So the Burr-Feinstein bill is sort of a model here. We looked at what would we want, what are the questions we want to ask of that, and can we use what OTA provides to be able to do that. So we looked at creating a legislative technology assessment. So committees or chairman and ranking members could ask OTA to basically score legislation on its effect on science, technology, and innovation environment, to include elements of security and privacy. And then finally, sort of expand assistance to members and committees. Now, this would be a provision in sort of a reestablishment of OTA that wouldn't change what OTA could provide, but it would highlight that to sort of remind stakeholders within Congress that OTA does provide services to members and committees, and that their work is relevant to committees.
Cool. All right, so let's open this up to a discussion. There's a lot of expertise, a lot of perspectives in the audience here, and particularly on thinking about how we might move this forward. There's folks who have experience working at OTA, there are folks who are tuned to what the political environment looks like now. What needs to happen? What issues does this raise?